Apuryamanam achala pratishtham samudramapa pravishanti yadvat tadvat kamayam pravishanti sarve sashantimapnoti na kamakami.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Chitheads podcast. My guest today is Vineet Chander. Vineet is the coordinator for Hindu life and Hindu chaplain at Princeton University and a religious life leader at the Lawrenceville School. He has also served as an adjunct professor, attorney, and communications consultant. His areas of specialty include bhakti theology, models of pastoral counseling, and the Hindu American diaspora community. His writing has appeared in a number of publications, and he is co-author of Hindu Chaplaincy and co-editor of Hindu Approaches to Spiritual Care, Chaplaincy in Theory and Practice. A student of His Holiness Radhanath Swami for more than 2 decades, he is a sought-after speaker and teacher in his own right, particularly known for his ability to infuse ancient wisdom with humor, relevant examples, and avenues for application. He has spoken at a number of conferences and educational institutions, including the American Academy of Religion, the Global Dharma Conference, the Global Chaplains Conference, Yale University, Cornell University, and the Harvard Divinity School at Harvard University. In addition, he has offered wisdom teachings in a number of temples, ashrams, and yoga studios, including the philosophy portions of YTT courses at Gratitude Yoga, Prana Yoga Shala, and Onyx Yoga. He is a regular speaker at and past board member of the Bhakti Center, which is here in New York City. So hello, Vineet. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So thank you for starting us off with that beautiful chant. Do you want to begin by maybe unpacking the meaning of that chant for the listeners?
Sure, I'd be happy to. That particular shloka is from the 2nd chapter of the Gita. It's not something that I typically chant as part of my spiritual practice, but something I've been reflecting on lately. So I thought I would just offer that as a point of reflection or meditation. This is Sri Krishna's instruction to Arjuna in the 2nd chapter, reminding him of the yogi's ability to maintain stability, even in, and especially perhaps in the face of seemingly unlimited provocations and cravings. He says, just as the ever-filled ocean remains steady and undisturbed, although waters are constantly flowing into it from every side, in the same way, one who is undisturbed by the constant flow of cravings and desires experiences peace within, not one who strives to fulfill those cravings.
What a beautiful shloka. Thank you for sharing that. We're going to talk about chaplaincy today and your role as the first full-time Hindu chaplain at an American college or university. That's at Princeton. Can you tell us a little bit about what led you to this work? What, about your own kind of evolution and your spiritual practice led you to the decision to become a Hindu chaplain?
Yeah, I think when we talk about the decision to become a chaplain, we're perhaps being a little too generous. I don't know how much of a decision it was, as much as it was maybe
a
calling that I was very stubborn in trying to ignore and refuse for a while. I grew up in a Hindu-American family, although I sometimes only half-jokingly refer to it as an analog to the cultural Jew or the secular Jew, right? I grew up in this very kind of cultural Hindu-American family. Faith was present in our lives, but I don't think it was by any means a centerpiece of our household. Unlike some other folks, I didn't grow up, for instance, with a particular mandir or a community that I was affiliated with. We didn't have like a family spiritual teacher or anything of the sort. But it was always sort of a presence, and it was always something that I knew was a part of my identity, even if I couldn't quite articulate how. At the risk of sounding a little cliche, when I hit my teenage years, I became a nightmare to my parents. And
as we all did.
As we all do. But part of the way it manifested for me was I just became this moody, angsty teenager that, among other things, started to just question everything.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that ended up opening a door kind of unexpectedly into the spiritual, because my questioning sort of blossomed into these larger existential questions. And as I said, we weren't a particularly like orthodox religious family, but my parents, trying their best, would occasionally like take us to religious festivals at temples and things like that. I grew up in New York City, and so we were fortunate that there were Hindu mandirs around and communities to connect to. And some of my memories of this time is I would go to these gatherings and I would be really fixed on just asking a lot of questions, to the point where I think I was upsetting people and starting to like annoy some of these religious leaders who were probably more used to folks just sort of following along ritualistically. And here's this Indian American kid who is just asking all of these questions. The less satisfied I was in terms of answers coming from those sources, the more I turned to just doing a lot of reading and study on my own. I like to say the New York City Public Library became my house of worship.
Oh, love it. I love it.
And, to make a long story slightly shorter, I ended up, after a brief but meaningful flirtation with atheism, it's necessary. We all need to date atheism.
We all need to doubt, have some kind of formative doubt. Yeah.
But for me, what that kind of it admittedly immature but earnest in its own way kind of journey led to was a real connection with spiritual traditions, both outside of Hinduism, but also kind of in a way, it led to me appreciating the wealth of spiritual traditions within the umbrella category of Hinduism. And for me, the traditions that really spoke to me most strongly and clearly were the traditions that were very much infused with the idea of love and devotion. So for me, the connection that really started to form was one of bhakti. The reason I start there is I think it was around this time, right? Like, so high school and maybe now, kind of getting into, thinking about what I'd like to study in college, where I started to feel the first sort of inklings of, I would love to really deep dive, into the spiritual. And I think if I were a little bit more honest with myself back then, I would have ended up probably pursuing religion and spirituality in terms of my academic study and perhaps in terms of a profession. But I think I hesitated to do that. There was a lot of pressure when I was growing up, particularly for, kids in the South Asian community and diaspora communities generally, to study sort of more quote unquote respectable sort of professional fields. If I'm being honest, I think I ended up sort of bowing to a little bit of that pressure and went the route of studying law instead. One thing I did do, though, that it would be an understatement to say I'm grateful for this. It was the game changer for me, is I took some time between undergrad and law school to spend time living and studying in a traditional Hindu ashram setting. I stayed in an ashram here in the United States, as well as one in Mumbai, India. And I knew that it was, for me, a kind of a temporary gap year type of program, right? I was under no illusions that I would, become a monk. That just wasn't in the cards for me. Nor was it really something that I sort of felt called to do. But I did really want to just take that time to just connect with the texts and the teachings and with that lifestyle. And it was an amazing experience, and something that I'm so grateful for, and something that really made such a deep impression on my heart and on my mind. So I arrived to law school now having had this amazing experience, right? this spiritually nourishing, this intellectually stimulating experience. I show up to law school and now I've got a head and heart full of like Bhagavad Gita shlokas and, mantras and Vedanta and yoga philosophy. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this now? Am I supposed to just switch gears and just, put all that on hold and start to, memorize statutes and
Oh, that sounds terrible.
As a person of faith and as by this point a kind of a somewhat committed, bhakti yogi, devotee, I prayed on it. Part of my prayer was asking my beloved source, my Lord, please help me to see what I'm meant to do with this, right? How are these pieces supposed to fit together? How would you like me to be an instrument of your grace and your wisdom? And practically speaking, almost, I think maybe even the same day I dared to utter that prayer, I was walking across campus and happened to bump into an activity fair that was set up by some undergraduates. And I happened to meet these lovely Hindu American students, all undergrads, who had a student group. And I connected with them and I asked them, what sort of activities do you guys do? And they told me a little bit about what they had done up to that point. But then they said, what we're really hoping to do this year, if we could just find, sort of the right teacher or the right facilitator, is we would really just love to do some study of like the Bhagavad Gita. And it was one of these moments, it was just like, it just like landed in my lap as the answer to my prayer. So I connected with this group and forged friendships that continue to this day. I ended up becoming a kind of, an older brother figure, so to speak, and kind of tried my best to hold this space and facilitate the study and engagement with, with Hindu philosophy, with living out some of these teachings. And it was these students who asked if I would be open to serving as their chaplain. And now you have to understand, up to this point, the only time I had ever heard that term was probably the old TV show MASH, where you had the army chaplain, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, it was always like a figure like that, a Christian minister or something who's like serving in a hospital or in the military or something to that effect. But nothing that really kind of connected to the way I thought about me and my faith. But what I came to understand was that this idea of chaplaincy had broadened out and was broadening out. And where I went to school, this is at George Washington University in DC, the model of chaplaincy there, which is a model that is on many campuses, was one of a body of volunteers who were from multiple faith communities and who worked with their faith communities and served and offered care to them. I agreed with a lot of encouragement from these students and from others. And I served as their student chaplain or their volunteer chaplain. And I absolutely loved it. It was probably the most fulfilling thing I got to do during those law school years. And I promised myself that if ever the opportunity arose, I would love to return to chaplaincy.
I was going to actually ask you if you finished law school, but you're about to go into that. So go ahead.
Yeah. And I'm sorry if this is like a very long-winded story.
No, I love it. It's beautiful.
So I graduated law school, took and somehow, mysteriously enough, passed the bar and got what I thought was my dream job, which was being a prosecutor at the DA's office in New York City. On paper, everything was lining up, right? Everything I could have asked for was just falling into place. What I discovered, kind of much to my surprise and perhaps even horror, only a few months into the job was, although everything made sense on paper, nothing seemed to make sense in terms of what I was feeling. I wasn't feeling fulfilled. I wasn't feeling connected. I wasn't feeling like I was in integrity with what I was meant to do and be. And it was a really odd feeling because I think sometimes when we set out to do something and then we discover we're not very good at it, it can be really jarring and painful. But I think it's another level of discomfort when we set out to do something, we're good at it, to some degree. We receive external praise and accolades and affirmation, and yet we're still left feeling internally hollow and empty and unfulfilled. And this is what was starting to happen to me. And I realized, particularly, after confiding in my wife and friends and mentors, I came to realize that either I needed to make a change or I needed to find a way to make this work in the long run. But the current situation was just not tenable. It wasn't sustainable. I kind of realized that if there was ever a time to make a wild, illogical, irrational, leap of faith, this was probably it. I was young enough. We didn't have kids at that point. I was thankfully free of debt, right? And decided to take the leap. So I resigned my position and I decided to pursue what I really felt drawn to, and what, if I was more honest with myself from the beginning, I probably would have gravitated towards anyway, which is spirituality and serving my community, and particularly working with young and emerging adults in my community. So I returned to chaplaincy. I served as a volunteer Hindu chaplain at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And after doing that for a little while and trying to serve my community in other ways and doing some freelance projects and some consulting, I was forwarded a job posting that a friend thought I might be a good fit from. And the posting was from Princeton University. Princeton was just starting to take the steps to pilot what would then become the first full-time Hindu life program. I applied for the position. I was blessed to be given the opportunity to run the program in its pilot year as its pilot coordinator, and then was invited to take on the position in a permanent full-time capacity. And it's been a little over a decade now.
Wow, it's been a decade. That's incredible. What a beautiful story. So what is chaplaincy and how does it differ from other forms of Hindu spiritual leadership?
So I don't think it's incorrect to connect chaplaincy to Christianity, right? I think it's, if we're going to understand a concept like chaplaincy, or a synonym for chaplaincy that I often use is pastoral care.
Right.
If we're to understand concepts like chaplaincy or pastoral care, I think we do need to reckon with the histories and the historical contexts that they emerge from. And these are Christian contexts. So the idea of chaplaincy, arises from this kind of vision of religious and spiritual leadership that looks at the spiritual leader as one who is a caregiver, an offerer of care, of solace, of counsel. There's a somewhat antiquated term, but I think it's a beautiful one, that says the term is cure of souls. And so this is what the chaplain is tasked with, the cure of souls. Now, cure in this sense is meant to connect to its original meaning, which is a synonym for care. So it's really caring for souls. But I think it's also meaningful that we could look at it in terms of cure, in terms of restoring one to a position of health. So just as we can do that on the physiological level, just as we can do that, and there's increasing appreciation for doing that on the level of mental and emotional wellness, there is a dimension of spiritual wellness. And so chaplaincy, in one sense, was designed to address caregiving and a restoration to health on that level of the spiritual dimension. Understanding, of course, that the spiritual dimension is intertwined with and intersects with the mental, the emotional, the behavioral, the physiological. If we are to care for people in the fullness of their personhood, we cannot neglect the spiritual dimension.
Mm.
So this is the kind of the foundation that of course, chaplaincy arises from. And it's also, as I said, known as pastoral care, kind of drawing from this image, as best I understand it, of Christ as the shepherd, and of the religious leader as one who serves as a pastor, serves in that spirit of the shepherd, calling out to and bringing back into the fold, the member of the flock, so to speak, that is in need of that attention or that care. So that's beautiful imagery. It's imagery that I've encountered in my own spiritual exploration, and it's an aspect of Christianity that I certainly appreciate as an outsider. But it's not necessarily the language that I would use in terms of my own Hindu faith. So this is where I think it's important that we recognize the roots of chaplaincy and pastoral care, but we also recognize that the field has grown and expanded. And so from those beginnings, we understand pastoral care now, or spiritual care even, to be holding space to accompany others in their suffering. It's a form of religious leadership or spiritual leadership, I think, that asks us to not turn away from the suffering that we see in others, but to lean into it and to accompany others in their own journey of, again, to go back to this idea of a restoration to health. One of the ways that pastoral care has really been beautifully expanded is the influence of Buddhist chaplains and caregivers who have introduced in a more explicit way, or at least we can say who've emphasized, because perhaps it was always there, but who've emphasized in a more explicit way the contemplative dimensions of pastoral care. The idea of a spiritual caregiver bringing radical, compassionate presence. Just that presence, right? We say just as if it's like, a minor thing. But as simple as it is, it's so profound, the act of spiritual presence. It's not entirely the language of Hindu theology. I think it resonates really, really well with Hindu theology. This idea of compassionate, contemplative presence, of spiritual accompaniment, of addressing the spiritual dimension, to address, to respond to the suffering that we see in others, as well as the suffering that we see in ourselves.
Yeah. Wow, that's beautiful. That's such a beautiful description. And I really appreciate the point you make about health and wellness being inclusive of, spiritual health, because it seems like, more and more the sort of secular wellness world is kind of contracting itself around notions of wellness that are sort of defined by, green juice and physical asana that's devoid of the spiritual teachings and things like this, and a kind of almost fear or a neglect of the spiritual conversation. So, on that topic of spiritual health, as in your experience over the last 10 years as a chaplain, could you describe or maybe share a few of what you've seen to be kind of the most common obstacles to those who you advise in terms of cultivating this spiritual health? Like what are people, at the college, university level, struggling with from a spiritual perspective?
What I've experienced, particularly in an environment like Princeton, but I think it would hold, in terms of other environments as well, is a kind of an unhealthy emphasis on validation and affirmation coming from the external. We're sort of collectively and perhaps individually as well, almost like addicted to success and achievement, almost the way, it's like a drug. We're like addicted to it like a drug, right? The notion that if I just have enough of X, Y, Z, I will be fulfilled. I will be happy. I will have arrived, right? That I will be enough when ...
Right. Yeah.
Right. And now it's easy to talk about that in the sense of critiquing sort of gross materialism. And I feel like thoughtful people increasingly, they're able to talk about that and to call that out, right? So, the idea that, I will be happy when I'm earning, six figures or more or whatever, right? I think a lot of people are able to sort of call that out. But I feel like where we're struggling is on the more subtle level, right? Because we bring that same kind of mentality, that same kind of externalizing of our contentment, of our fulfillment, of what it means to be a healthy, whole person. We project that in a host of subtle ways also, right? So thinking about, for instance, the way we approach relationships. I see this a lot with students. The approach to relationship is so often a kind of a subtle manifestation of this same tendency to externalize, this same tendency to look at things in terms of acquisition and attainment and achievement. In one sense, what we're doing is we're not really relating to one another as people anymore. We're actually, again, very subtly, so subtly that we would never dream, most of us would never dream we're even doing this, but we end up so often objectifying the other as a means to an end, right? So this person, this relationship has value in as much as it is somehow ticking off a box on my list, or it's making me feel like I am somehow, I've arrived in some way, right? I see this with students who externally seem to be some of the most popular students on campus, but who, for instance, will, sit in my office, or now in this, in the context of the pandemic, will, join me virtually on a Zoom call and will openly cry and express how absolutely and utterly alone they feel. One thinker refers to this as the epidemic, and this is pre-COVID, but we can only imagine how much worse this is in the context of COVID. The epidemic, he calls it, of loneliness, right? This is the real epidemic that's like raging across our country and increasingly across the kind of, globalized, westernized world. Right. In one sense, you can say, and I know it's tempting to just sort of bash on progress and technology and westernization and things like that. But I do think there's truth to that this notion that we are hyper connected in some ways, and along with it, we are utterly and profoundly disconnected from one another, but also deeply from ourselves. And so this epidemic of loneliness and disconnection is something that I think comes up again and again. And to me, it's very much related to this sort of idea of externalizing our happiness, externalizing our fulfillment, right? Looking for it out there, when if I could dare to turn within, if I could, and I say dare intentionally because it's I think terrifying as all hell for most of us. But if I can face the terror of quieting everything else down and looking inside, and I can deal with the abject horror of the possibility that I'm going to have to confront what's sitting in there in my heart. But if I can do that, I may actually find that fulfillment. The shloka that I chanted earlier from the Gita, I think, speaks to this really well, right? This idea of the ocean remaining undisturbed, remaining this beautiful, steady, stable, expansive force. How does it do that, despite the fact of these rivers, these bodies of water flowing into it, this constant, dynamic, influx of stimuli? How does the ocean remain the ocean? And I think this verse, the shloka, gives us a hint of this by pointing out the depth of the ocean. If we can learn to cultivate depth, if we can have that deep, rich inner life, which takes work, which takes courage to look within, then despite, the circumstances, right? It's not that those circumstances cease to exist. It's not like life becomes, whatever the cliche is, a bed of roses. Far from it. But now we have the resource. Well, two things. One is we have resources to actually address those provoking situations. We have a kind of a toolkit, a spiritual toolkit. But on a deeper level, we have a place of stability. We have a rich inner life, a rich source of nourishment and fulfillment and contentment. We don't need to look for it out there. We don't need to set ourselves up for disappointment and failure by setting our expectations in the outer world. We can reconnect to it constantly within ourselves.
Mm. So you've kind of unpacked this epidemic of loneliness so beautifully, and you're already kind of talking about the answer to this question, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about, for those that are listening and they're like, yes, I am experiencing that myself. You've talked about the spiritual toolbox. What are the kind of components from, this perspective of Hindu chaplaincy, the components of that spiritual toolbox that, the listeners might perhaps engage as a way to counteract this experience of loneliness?
So one of the things that I've encountered in my work as a Hindu chaplain is the need to borrow from frameworks that already exist, but also to look within my own tradition and to the wisdom of teachers and texts from within the Hindu world, to see what frameworks are offered there.
Mm.
And one of the frameworks that I found that it has deeply impacted my work and my own approach to offering care within my community is this framework that's found within Vedanta and yoga philosophy. It's a framework that holds essentially that we are at core perfected spiritual beings. We are sparks of a divine source that is pure being, that is pure awareness, that is ultimately pure bliss or pure joy. So that as a starting point, I think, is so powerful, right? To remind ourselves, not in a kind of, in a superficial way, but in a very deep sense, to remind ourselves that at core, I am fullness. At core, I am awareness. At core, I am bliss. I don't even say I have bliss or I have happiness, but I am that bliss. I am that happiness at core. And yet we also contend with, and I think this is the beauty of the framework, we contend with being embodied beings.
Mm.
So we're this core self that is this kind of pure being, pure awareness, pure joy or bliss. And at the same time, we are enmeshed in the experience of embodiment, which means we have to identify with and engage with the body-mind complex that we find ourselves in. The beauty of the framework, I think, is in how we can use our embodiment to connect with, or shall we say, reconnect with that spiritual core. So to get to the sort of practicality of this, right? How do we do that? Well, I think it starts with, again, this affirmation of who I am at core. And then it takes the form of what in my tradition is called Sādhanā, is called practice.
Yeah.
Engaging in a practice that helps us to constantly and consistently reconnect with that spiritual core, even as we are embodied beings. So how do we do that? I've really come to appreciate a teaching that's given in a couple of places. Of course, it's given in the Bhagavad Gita. It's given in some of the Upanishads and the Vedanta Sutra. One place that it interestingly comes up is in the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali. It shows up there in the second chapter of that book, where this idea of sadhana is broken down into three constituent pieces. And I found this to be such a powerful, to use that term again, such a powerful toolkit to offer to folks as they're engaging in this work of reconnecting with that inner life. So the three pieces of the toolkit, the first is called tapa, or tapasya. And listeners who are perhaps familiar with yoga practice and tradition may recognize this word. It's usually translated as austerity. I like to translate it as discipline, even self-discipline, because what I understand tapa to offer us is as a tool in our toolkit is it's an opportunity to, with intention, to cultivate and to start to craft for ourselves a regimen of discipline. In other words, how do I want to show up in the world? How do I want to engage with the world around me? How do I want to engage with other folks? What do I want my relationships to look like? What do I want my core values to be? How do I want those core values to be communicated, right? It's one thing to come up with a beautiful and impressive list of virtues. It's another thing to live them out. So how do I want to live my life in such a way that there's integrity between what I state or what I hold and aspire towards as my values, as my core values, and how, as I sometimes say, how I show up at 3:45 in the afternoon when I'm online at Target and I'm pissy and I've been having a rough day, and the cashier doesn't seem to know what he's doing, right? That was an oddly specific example. So maybe that's something.
It was a recent event for you, I imagine.
Right, but what I love about that is it takes a concept like tapasya and it says, all right, let's just cut the shit, take it from this place of lofty ideals, and how do I show up in those tiny moments where no one is going to see me? Right? These are not the moments where I can posture in front of my community or I can hold forth as some amazing yogi. How do I show up, when I'm in my car and I'm stuck in traffic? How do I show up when I'm online at Target? How do I show up when my kid is driving me up the wall and, and I'm tempted to just tell them off or just shoot them down or whatever. There's a million applications of this, right? How do I show up in those moments? And to me, that is where the answer to that question is going to be a reflection of what I'm doing with tapas in my life, what I'm doing with intentionally crafting this idea of discipline, of will, of how I act and live, and where that integrity is or isn't showing up. So that's that first piece, this idea of tapas. And I think it's linked to austerity, or why tapas is often translated as austerity is the good and bad news is it's not easy. It's not pleasant. There's this teaching around tapas that says tapas is choosing the good over the pleasurable. Or in Sanskrit, choosing shreya over preya, right? Having the long view, which sometimes means, or which often means, I think, accepting some short-term discomfort or sacrifice, some renunciation of immediate gratification for this, larger project of building my will, of crafting this sort of discipline that helps me to show up as my best self in the world, right? So that's tapasya. Now, the more we do that, hopefully the sort of clearer our kind of mental and emotional space becomes, right? The more we're living with integrity, the more we're showing up with integrity, the more we're making those lifestyle and, those behavioral choices which help us to be our best selves. The more we do all that, the more we give ourselves the precious gift of space and energy to cultivate contemplation. And so the second tool in our toolkit is what's called Svādhyāya. And Svādhyāya means, it literally means self-study, and it could be understood as sort of contemplative practices more generally, right? So this is where meditation comes in. I often find there's a lot of kind of I would say misunderstandings or assumptions that people have about meditation, and among them is this idea that meditation is all about sort of relaxing and feeling zen. And if I'm not like totally relaxed and just like, again, to use this sort of terrible term, if I'm not like feeling super zen, then I must not be doing meditation right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sometimes we might have experiences of just feeling like very calm, and those are blessings. But often meditation as a practice is, again, it's hard work, right?
Yeah.
Building, to me, the reason it's hard work is I think any practice is hard work. It's building that muscle memory, right? When my daughter practices violin, it's a drag. It's a drag to do scales over and over again. It's a drag to work on the same piece and try to, to go over it again and again, and to hear it and try to adjust and to build up that skill. But we engage in practice not to feel great in practice. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But we engage in practice to sort of build that muscle memory, so that that ability to turn within, to quiet the external, and to even quiet the mental chatter, that becomes like second nature to us. That starts to become like our new default position. And so Svādhyāya is very much a practice. So Svādhyāya becomes this practice that allows us to build the muscle memory of quieting the external world, but perhaps more importantly, of being able to quiet even the internal mental chatter that so often stands in our way, that so often prevents us from being able to connect to that deeper self, that true self within. If we can learn to quiet the mental chatter, then we get to tune into that voice of inner guidance coming from the true self. But it takes practice. And so that's what Svādhyāya is designed to do, to give us the opportunities to intentionally, to consistently, to repetitively, to sincerely turn to practice, and to build up that inner resilience, to build up that ability to tune out the external and to tune into the internal. The final piece of sadhana that's offered in this toolkit given to us in the Yoga Sutras and elsewhere is a really powerful practice called Īśvarapraṇidhāna. Īśvara is a term that's found in yoga philosophy and in Hindu metaphysics for the divine. It's a somewhat open-ended term, and the understanding is Īśvara is personal to all of us. Īśvara is divinity as he, she, they, it shows up for us and reveals itself for us, first and foremost within the core of our hearts.
Mm.
Pranidhana refers to the act of, sometimes it's translated as submission or surrender, but I like an alternate translation that says pranidhana is the act of making the object of our devotion the centerpiece. So Īśvarapraṇidhāna is this act of centering or recentering on divinity. And I know that that can be challenging for some folks, particularly if theism is not, a huge part of their spiritual practice or their metaphysical or spiritual paradigm. But I like that Īśvarapraṇidhāna, whether we're theists or not, I happen to be a theist. I happen to be someone who identifies with a devotional, relational, personal tradition. So for me, Īśvarapraṇidhāna is a very personal thing. It's about having a relationship with God, with the divine, in a very intimate, personal way. But even if someone doesn't have that as a part of their spiritual walk, I love that Īśvarapraṇidhāna challenges us to think about and to reach out to even that which is beyond us. It's wonderful to affirm ourselves and ultimately to affirm that deepest self that at least Vedanta and yoga hold is the core essence of who we are. It's wonderful to affirm one another and to seek to find grace and beauty in other living beings, and that's an important part of the tradition. But I love that Īśvarapraṇidhāna reminds us that beyond all of that, there is the transcendence. Whether we think of that transcendence in terms of a deity, we think of that transcendence as the wholeness and fullness of the universe, right? Like as some teachers point out, the kind of the whole that is greater than the sum of its parts.
Mm-hmm.
Or whether we think of that transcendence as simply the reality of a mystery that is and forever shall be beyond us. That transcendence is that which we will never be able to fully grasp, that which we will never be able to encapsulate and quantify and grasp within the bounds of our mental and intellectual and even emotional exercises. That there will always be something that is the wonderful mystery that is beyond us, even if it's just a recognition of that mystery. And I don't say just in a dismissive sense, but I say it in the sense of recognizing the sort of beautiful simplicity of that idea. Whatever it is, the idea that our toolkit is not complete until we recognize something beyond us, I think is such a powerful and beautiful piece to sadhana, to practice. And so Īśvarapraṇidhāna is an invitation to, with intention and with purpose, to make that centering of that which is beyond us, to make that a part of our spiritual practice and of how we live our lives. That's going to look different for people. And so the traditional sort of approach to Īśvarapraṇidhāna is things like devotional practices. In my tradition, worship, as it's known as puja, this sort of ritualized act of making offerings as a reminder of our own dependence, of our own kind of humbling ourselves before the divine. So Īśvarapraṇidhāna can certainly take those forms, but I think also as we think in a more sort of expansive or universal sense, Īśvarapraṇidhāna can also show up as things like a practice of devotional journaling, nature walks, of meditation on the transcendent mystery, however that shows up for us. So, for some folks, it could be something as simple as making it a point to sit before the majestic beauty of a sunrise or a sunset or a sky full of stars, and to own and embrace our own smallness, to allow ourselves to be humbled not in a way that humiliates us, not in a way that puts us down, but in a way that embraces and uplifts us in a recognition of our smallness and yet our inexplicable and indescribable role in the largeness of this infinite, expansive universe. Right? That, I think, is Īśvarapraṇidhāna.
Yeah. Well, thank you for walking us through. I wanted to talk about that. A lot of the content for the listeners that Vineet is discussing has come from an article I just read, which is from a Hindu chaplaincy book that you co-edited. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
On kind of unpacking the Kriya Yoga from the Yoga Sutras in this beautiful way that he's just done. And one of the things I really appreciated, particularly about that article, Vineet, was how you don't shy away from applying these teachings to a contemporary context. I know there's, especially in the contemporary time, there's a lot of kind of, sometimes there's a sensitivity around, applying things, taking them out of context in a certain way, which you even remark on at the end of the article. That you're quite self-aware about that. But I really appreciate this gesture of, as you say, applying old wisdom to new canvases, which is this beautiful phrase you use in the article. And the concept of Īśvarapraṇidhāna, I love the way you unpack that, because I think it's so humble in a way, and it really honors the kind of diversity of experiences of the divine, which, as you've just described, actually also embraces, which I think is an important thing for people to hear, the atheistic perspective. I mean, you don't even have to have a conception of the divine in a kind of more theological way to experience Īśvara. If I understand you right, it seems like you're suggesting that Īśvara is even inclusive of whatever experience of the supreme might be experienced by anyone, no matter if they're theological or non-theological or non-theistic.
I think it is, and there's a lot of interesting exploration and even debate around this idea, because Patanjali is quite mysterious in terms of who or what Īśvara is. I mean, there's a little bit of an explication, but even that is I think quite open-ended. There's some speculation and some attempt to sort of historically trace if there was a singular personality teacher named Patanjali, what his own theological affiliation might be. But I also think there's something really cool and really refreshing about the fact that he seems to kind of intentionally and maybe even cheekily leave it open-ended. It's almost, I think, I read this to be like Patanjali saying, I'm not going to tell you who Īśvara is, because I don't want to limit it for you. I don't want to say, I don't want someone to read this or hear these teachings and think, oh, well, this is just for devotees of, Vishnu or for Shaivites or for Advaitins or whoever. No, Īśvara is accessible to anyone and everyone. But B, also, and this is my own interpretation, but I like it and I think it's fun. I kind of imagine Patanjali saying, like, I'm not going to tell you who Īśvara is. Like, that's part of the fun. You go out there and you figure out who Īśvara is for yourself. Like, why should I tell you? Like, don't be so lazy, dude. Just go out and, live the life and practice Kriya Yoga, and Īśvara is going to reveal himself or herself. Maybe we can say Īśvari, right? Because I don't think, even though Īśvara is linguistically in the masculine, I don't see this as a gendered directive. I think, there are beautiful feminine goddess sort of interpretations of Īśvarapraṇidhāna as well. So I see Patanjali saying, like, Īśvara, Īśvari reveal themselves to you. It's not about me telling you who they are. It's not even about you kind of finding the text or finding, the written description or, defining it. It's about when we are open to it, Īśvara, Īśvari divinity, mystery, transcendence, he, she, they, it reveals to us, right? And I love that language, that revelatory language, because again, it's humbling that it's not about my efforts, right? I will never do enough. And this, I want to harken back to something I was saying a little bit earlier about this sort of what I find is so problematically at the root of our own disconnection from ourselves, or disconnection from the world around us and from others, is this sort of unhealthy emphasis on our efforts, on our endeavor, on our achievement, right? And I talked about this as being an addiction of sorts, right?
Yeah.
And again, I feel like this emphasis on revelation is like this radical response to that, or this radical antipode to that says, if we're still talking in terms of how we can figure this out, how we can achieve this, how we can attain this, how we can, be smart enough, be well-read enough, be yogis enough, right? Be like,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because we project all this stuff even onto our spiritual practice. When I am X, Y, Z enough, then I will have figured it all out. I will have, I will be able to define once and for all who or what Īśvara is. And I see this approach of revelation as going, nope, like as long as you're thinking in those terms, you're missing the forest for the trees. As long as you're thinking in those terms, we're not even actually doing Īśvarapraṇidhāna. But when I let go of all those presuppositions, when I let go of all those expectations, when I let go of myself in the center as the arbiter of definition and meaning, as the definer, as the grasper, to use this kind of, I know it's a strange term in English, but you see this in sort of yoga philosophy all this time, this idea of graha, of grasping. When I can learn to let go of that need to constantly grasp, which is maybe kind of the need to constantly be in control, when I can learn to let go of that stuff, I start to take myself out of the center. I start to decenter, and then Īśvara can be in the center. Then the mystery can be revealed to me, not because I am ever XYZ enough, but when I've put myself in the best possible position I can be in, to allow the mystery to reveal and to unravel. Right? It's maybe a subtle turn, but I think it's like 180 degrees.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think that was definitely the most resonant unpacking of Īśvara that we've had on the podcast, at least for me. So thank you so much. And I think it's a beautiful note to end on. Of course, I had plans to talk to you about many things, and perhaps we'll have to have another episode because I know we're coming up on the close of our time together. You have to move on to a led meditation and practice and teaching.
Yeah, well, just see how devious I am that I've managed to squander all of our time and ensure a second podcast out of the deal.
Absolutely. No, everything you've said has been so beautiful. It's so wonderful to hear you speak and to explore all these topics in such depth and detail. It's really quite wonderful. So Vineet, as we close, I'd love to give you an opportunity just to share a little bit about how people can learn more about you. Are you doing any online kind of workshops? I mentioned this teaching. Is that something that's open to the public? Anything you'd like to share about how folks can find out more about you?
Yeah, well, thank you for that opportunity. And let me just say thank you so much for this conversation. It's just been such a gift and a pleasure and an honor. So thank you. In terms of keeping in touch, it's something that I would love to keep in touch, and a lot of the programming that I do have the honor to help coordinate through Princeton is open to the larger public, and especially in these days of remote programming is more and more now open to a very wide public beyond even geographic bounds. So happy to have folks tune into some of our public programming. On the other hand, I also, I'm still trying to sort of figure out what my relationship with this new world of, of almost unlimited content looks like. And just
Yeah,
to be very honest, part of my own kind of struggle with that, if I can use that word, is um, I think I have my own sort of inclinations towards turning everything into a kind of a commodity and a product and an achievement and accomplishment. So
sure.
I'm not quite sure what that's going to look like as far as, as we continue. But I'm happy to put forth some of these online offerings. And if they're helpful to people, I do consider that, just a gift to be able to offer that. I think the best way of folks to be able to keep in touch with me is you could go ahead and visit the website for the Hindu Life program at Princeton, which again I do have the pleasure of coordinating. That website is hindu.princeton.edu, and when you go on that website, you could sign up for our newsletter, find out about upcoming events. And find out how you can connect to things like our weekly meditations or teachings, and how to just sort of be in touch, even on a one-on-one basis, which I'm happy to do as time and my energy.
Mm. All right. Well, thank you for sharing all that. And for the listeners, do check out that website. And I have been speaking with Vineet Chander, who is the coordinator of Hindu Life and Hindu Chaplain at Princeton University. Vineet, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Jacob. It's been my honor and pleasure.